elements that keeps coming up for me is that this sense of the broken promise, or the struggle with that. And I was thinking of a friend of mine, a good friend, Georg Forstein, who I know quite well, and his time of leaving Adida's community and Adida himself, and the time when he went to the island and had his time there, and when he came back decided to leave. And then that caused the same kind of turmoil for him from the voices of the community of breaking the eternal vows, and you're going to suffer many, many years. And I came across something that, in as you know, Adida has collected a body of books and literature that he calls the Great Tradition, and has put it into the Seven Schools of God talk, or whatever terms. But I came across something that he wrote because he reviewed a book by Georg Forstein. And I don't know if you've heard this, but I would like to read it and then have you comment on it.
Okay.
And so it says, in 1980, and this is Adida writing, it says, in the 1980s, Georg Forstein was, for a time, a formal student and a beginning student practitioner apprenticing with the general community of my devotees. And as such, he formally and intensively studied my teaching relative to the way of the heart. Eventually, Georg Forstein discontinued his participation as a formal student and beginning student practitioner of the way of the heart, in order that he might fulfill his previous commitment to pursue a career as a freelance scholar of the literature of the traditional yoga. Nevertheless, as his subsequent writings oftentimes demonstrates, he remains an informal student of my revelatory and instructive word, and he is, in fact, expresses his gratitude and his indebtedness to me in this book, which was the Yoga, the Technology of Ecstasy. What he says there in that writing is that he has blessed Georg's leaving. And in the eyes of the social circumstances of Georg leaving, it appeared that he broke and was leaving the eternal guru and going to endure hellish karma, as you said. But it doesn't, I mean, obviously, Adida says that you're not supposed to hang around and always be in that formal circumstance, although it might appear that there's this struggle going on one level, and on another level, there's something else happening here. And so I guess one of the things that I also would like to point to is that he says that he acknowledges Adida. Do you in your work acknowledge or
Very
give?
definitely.
Yeah.
Very definitely. But and by the way, this is something that Terry Patton and I talked about recently on an interview or conversation we had for his Beyond Awakening series, and we specifically got into a piece at the end of that, whatever it was, hour and a half.
Which for the listeners tonight, or watchers, it's on the B-Zone, so...
Oh yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah,
Right.
I have posted on my sites also. We specifically wanted to get into a discussion of Adida because there's a kind of I don't want to say objectivity, but there's a quality to the voice of what one has to say that you only gain by renouncing the security of the apparent inclusion in the fold.
Right.
And for whatever reasons, Georg in his time, Terry and I both, and others, have had to take that step. And I've always been very explicit in my work with people about what I regard to be the immense gifts of Adida in his realization, transmission, and his teaching, even though there's a great deal about the specifics of his dharma, the expression of the wisdom, and also his methodology as a teacher that I would never choose to endorse or practice myself. But I feel, and I've said this with Terry, I've said this in conversations with Ken Wilber that are on the Integral Life archives of talks. I've always felt that we make a grave, we deprive ourselves if, as many people today still do, we assume that because Adida was as controversial and strange in his behavior and blah, 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 as he was, therefore he has not otherwise also made a tremendous contribution.
Right.
From my perspective, his contribution, well, for me, both Ramana Maharshi and Adida, and in some ways, especially each of them, but big parts Adida, his transmission, his blessing of all beings, which, as in some ways we can extrapolate out, his blessing wasn't as universal. It's just a given. So there's something that he brought into manifestation that, yeah, you could say theoretically, in principle, there's always great blessing, and there is, but there's a piece that he brought in that is a gift to everybody, and is literally always helping to awaken the heart and the fullness of being of humankind. And then there's a whole lot more that could be said, including details of his teachings that are very, very relevant for what I'm trying to do, what Linda, my wife, and I, and our community are doing. And I completely agree. I appreciate what he said about Georg, and I interpret it similarly. This is his way of saying, Georg, blessings.
Yeah.
I never had that go on for whatever reason. Directly from him, I would hear at various times that he continued to regard me as a devotee, which at the time I wasn't necessarily too thrilled to hear. I was like, well, yeah, but not the way. But after his death, actually, I had a dream with him that was really. I had longed for some kind of meeting that, after waking up, I would feel was authentic. And very briefly in this dream, he showed up in a very social circumstance, and people were around doing all these things. And he said to me, kind of looking off in a distance, he said to me, very passionately, he says, "Can you tell me even one thing you ever did for me?" And he had long hair at the time, and I reached over and I literally kind of brushed his hair back from his ear, and I was going to whisper in his ear, and I was thinking about this biography, The Divine Emergence of the World Teacher, which at the time he said basically fine, which coming from him was like AAA plus. Then he listed all these places that were typos, which was his way of saying, I felt, I read every word of it, you bastard. Not bad. But, so I was going to say, yeah, I wrote that book. And then, instead I was overwhelmed with a whole lot, and so as I got to him, I whispered passionately in his ear, "Beloved, I gave you everything. I gave you 13 years of my life." And I felt it just go in. And the tension broke.
Right.
And then the dream shifted, and he was over talking to somebody else. And I said, wait a minute, what was it, 13 years? And I shouted over the room, it was 20 years! And then there was another, kind of the next moment was he and I were just together personally, for whatever this is worth. I mean, this is just my dream. I interpret it my way. Other people can say what they wish. But he said to me, will you stay with me? And I was, by way of explaining that I couldn't, I started to say, well, as you know, as I'm sure you know, I've become a teacher myself. And I was about to say, I have experienced people leaving who I love, who can't stay. But as soon as I said, as you may know, I've become a teacher myself, his eyes rolled up and the dream ended. But, I was, in my day, I was a very passionate devotee, so it meant a lot to me too.
Well, absolutely, and as you said, I mean, you're a young adult and coming into his world and his universe and his power.
Mm-hmm.
You were completely absorbed into that.
Yeah.
For 20 years.
Nearly 20 years.
20 years. Well, I could go